On July 28th, 2016, Tim and I were blessed with a beautiful baby boy named Jackson. Jackson was our miracle child. He's perfect in our eyes, and you would never know it by looking at him, but Jackson is very, very sick and fighting for his life on the inside. We were told at one point in time that we wouldn't even be able to have kids. The doctors told us that we had to either do in vitro fertilization or, adopt. That was basically our only options.
I remember sitting at church on Sunday. The doctor had just told me on Thursday that I was not pregnant. I said, God, I know there's not a baby in my belly, but just please put one in there. And on Monday, we took a pregnancy test and we found out that we were pregnant.
So fast forward to Jackson's 4-month pediatrician appointment. To this point, Jackson's been a healthy kid, playing, just happy. So our pediatrician heard a heart murmur. We take Jackson to get checked out at the cardiologist. They bring him back and they're doing all kinds of scans, putting little electrodes and whatnot all over his body and just running various scans on him to make sure he's okay. Everything seems to be going well, but all of a sudden the doctor eventually comes back and talks to me. He goes on to describe to me about what the normal pressure inside of a person's heart should be. And then he tells me what Jackson's pressures are. Jackson's pressures were about 3 times of what it should be. And my first thought to the doctor, I said, that doesn't sound good. And he said, no, it's not. So what we had to do at that point in time was take Jackson immediately to Vanderbilt to have him observed overnight, and he was going to have a procedure done in the morning. So leaving the cardiologist, I really didn't know what to think. I still had to go deliver the news to Timmy, which was terrible because, I don't know, it was just a really hard thing to do.
Whenever you came back from the cardiologist and you told me what the doctors told you, I was still in disbelief. I was not ready to believe that there was something wrong with our perfect little boy.
We didn't know what to expect. We just knew that Jackson was going to undergo this procedure called a heart catheterization. I'm kind of just thinking we'll be here, a night or 2 at most. They'll go in, they'll figure out what's wrong with Jackson, and we'll go home. Everything will be perfectly fine. Unfortunately, the truth was far from that. So Jackson has to go under sedation to have this procedure done, and we don't see him, I'd say, for at least 6 to 8 hours, something like that. And during this whole time, we're freaking out, just hoping that everything goes fine. So we eventually get a call for us to go down and have a consultation, with the doctors so they can let us know how everything went.
I'll never forget the look on that doctor's face when he came back and told me he was shaking, and he said, I don't know how Jackson has made it this far, and I don't know if he's going to be able to survive his ICU experience.
The right heart catheterization, the procedure that Jackson had to undergo, did accurately diagnose that he had what's called pulmonary arterial hypertension. The blood vessels in his lungs are either have thickened walls or they're more narrow than the average person. What this causes is it creates more work for the heart and excess pressure, so the heart has to actually work much harder than it normally would to actually pump blood through those veins and those arteries. Eventually, this can lead to right heart failure over time. The average life expectancy is 2.8 years. Fortunately, he was born with a defect in his heart. It's a hole in his heart, or the hole in the tissues in between his heart, that essentially has worked as a pressure release valve. So he was born actually with this hole that was allowing pressure to release. Had that hole not been there, or he born with that, he could have passed away at any time, while he was sleeping at night.
And somebody may ask, how did you not know your child was so critically ill? Well, with pulmonary hypertension, it is a silent disease. A child could look perfectly fine, can look like any other child, but inside, they're fighting for their life.
In my head, I'm like, okay, we know what he's got now, let's go ahead and fix it. Well, unfortunately, it's just not that simple. There's no cure for pulmonary hypertension. It's a progressive disease. It gets worse as he ages. His heart, essentially running at a marathon pace, can eventually cause heart failure. So the only way that you really can treat pulmonary hypertension is with medicine or with a lung transplant.
And right now there's no FDA-approved medication for children.
The major problem is a lot of what we're doing with Jaxon, he's basically just a guinea pig. We're trying medications that are normally used in adults or much older patients. And unfortunately, to this point, none of them have actually, I would say, make Jaxon better. He hasn't gotten worse, but he's not necessarily getting better. He's still growing at a good rate, and that's one thing to celebrate. But at the same time, the pressure, his heart, that's the main concern, and to this point it hasn't really gone down. It's just kind of remained the same. Eventually, after the procedure, we get to see Jaxon, but it's not like Jaxon is just up and moving around or anything like that. No, he's actually been moved to the pediatric ICU, and he has all kinds of tubes going into his nose and his legs and his arms.
He doesn't even look like himself. He is swollen all over. I didn't recognize him. They told me exactly what room Jaxon was in, and I walked past the room because I didn't recognize my baby boy.
We went into the hospital around December 15th, and I was thinking to myself, okay, you know, at first we're in here a day or two, okay, no big deal, but it carried on, and then I thought to myself, okay, as long as we get him out by Christmas, you know, at least he can come home and enjoy his first Christmas. But he couldn't do that. You know, he missed that important milestone, and that was one of the hardest parts for me, is just seeing your first child not be able to celebrate their first Christmas. I mean, he was just in the hospital asleep. We brought in a stocking for him, and we were there for him for Christmas. But he missed Christmas at home. He didn't get to open his presents or anything. He had been, you know, fully sedated for, I'd say, about 3 weeks or so, and they had started to slowly wean him off those medications so they could prepare him for extubating him, taking the tube out. So that happened in about 3 weeks, and we were very nervous that, you know, he wouldn't make it. They, in fact, brought chaplains into the room with us and were essentially preparing us for the worst, preparing us to say goodbye to Jaxon. But we never believed that for a second, because we know Jaxon, and that was the one variable that they really couldn't account for. They didn't know Jaxon, they didn't know how strong he was, and they didn't know how much of a fighter he was. Every time they tried to poke him or prod him or do anything to him, Jaxon fought it. And I love seeing that. Even though he was in pain, I love seeing that because I knew he wasn't giving up. About 3 weeks, they finally get the tube out, and that was a great moment for us, because they took the tube out, and even seconds after that, we were right up in his face, and he smiled at us and grinned at us, and you know, got to hold himself after that.
Hi, big boy. What you doing? What you been up to? Did you watch some cartoons, huh?
While we were at the hospital, I remember us like having a serious conversation and really wanting to just, for the doctors to stop everything. We just wanted to take our baby boy home, because in our eyes, when we brought Jaxon in, he was healthy and he was just fine. And it was like, when we took him to the hospital, they made him sick. And to see him in the state that he was in was so scary.
Yeah, and obviously that wasn't the case. We know that the doctors didn't make him sick, but that's the way we felt, and that's, you know, we put that guilt on ourselves, and we were kicking ourselves, thinking, what have we done to our child? You know, we may never see him again, and that's possible. I mean, pretty much the worst moments of our life, I think. So they get Jaxon extubated, and then the next step from there is to get him moved out of the ICU, which we did in a few days. We were there for about a week, and during that time it was just to help us get acclimated to basically our, I hate this saying, but our new normal, as a lot of people were putting it. You know, he is getting 4 to 5 oral medications 2 times a day, but the one that's really a pain in the butt is the Remodulin that is attached to, currently it's on his arm, but we have to rotate it every 2 or 3 weeks to different spots of his body because the medicine is so harsh on the skin. They leave terrible scars, and it's painful for him. You can't get the medicine wet, because if it gets wet, it gets infected, which means he can't go swimming. We can't do baths normal. It just alters your whole life, basically. Because Jaxon was intubated for so long, we think that that could have led to him not being able to swallow properly now. So you know, the tube that goes in his nose and all the way down to his stomach, it's an NG tube, and that's actually how he gets all of his feeds now. We are still practicing with baby food, and he can practice with bottles, but he's not quite there yet in terms of taking the volume, but that has been a daily struggle, just getting him to eat correctly again.
He doesn't ever get a chance to have the desire to eat because we're constantly feeding him through his NG tube.
Yeah, it's just it's a struggle. You know, you want him to grow. That's the most important thing, is that he grows, but you also want him to be interested in food and get hungry.
Whenever we were in the hospital, I remember the doctors telling us about lung transplant, that Jaxon might need a lung transplant in the far future. Well, we thought the far future was maybe whenever he's a teenager. Well, our last doctor's visit, we found out that it's gotten to that point, and Jaxon is indeed going to need a lung transplant in the next year or 2 years. They said that if he does not get a lung transplant, his life expectancy is going to be 2 to 4 years of age.
And he would have to take immune suppressant medication for the rest of his life, and which isn't necessarily, it's probably a better option than what he's going through right now, but the problem is that the lungs are the most infected part of the body, so there's a possibility that he may have to get multiple lung transplants over his lifetime. So, you know, we're stuck here, you know, thinking, do we roll the dice? Do we just, you know, can Jaxon make it past those 2 to 4 years that we were basically told his life expectancy is? I mean, can he somehow outgrow it? The doctors don't believe he can, because the cause of his pulmonary hypertension is genetic mutation that has caused it, and they think because it's genetic that he won't outgrow it, but they also didn't think he would make it out of the ICU. So there's just a lot of things to consider, a lot of heavy decisions we have to make in the next coming months. Two of the main websites you can go to are phassociation.org and phaware.com. Those websites have a lot of good resources and information about pulmonary hypertension, and also ways that you can donate to help find a cure for pulmonary hypertension. There was a quote I heard recently that really stuck with me from an injured football player. He said, "Tough times don't last, tough people do." And that's what I think about every day when I think about Jaxon. Jaxon's the toughest kid I've ever seen in my life, and if anybody's going to beat this disease, it's going to be him.